My husband worked nights, but the black man next door never let me sleep. Disclaimer. This content is only for a mature audience. Viewer discretion is advised. Sometimes the quietest streets hide the loudest secrets. From the outside, my marriage looked ordinary. My husband worked long night shifts and I stayed home, trying to keep myself busy, waiting for him to return. But the silence of the nights wasn't what haunted me the most. It was the presence of the man next door. A man whose eyes seemed to notice the very things my husband no longer paid attention to. At first, it felt harmless, like a passing glance, a polite hello across the fence. But slowly, I realized that some moments carry more weight than words. You see, when you spend countless nights alone, it changes something inside you. The walls feel closer, the clock ticks louder, and even the smallest gestures can feel like lifelines. And that's where the man next door stepped in. He was different, attentive in ways that unsettled me. It wasn't just about attraction, it was about being seen, about having someone look past the surface and into the emotions I had long buried. The more my husband drifted into his world of work, the more I found myself pulled into the quiet yet undeniable presence that lived only a few steps away. This story isn't about quick choices or careless mistakes. It's about loneliness, unmet needs, and the dangerous spaces between what we want and what we already have. I didn't go looking for trouble, but somehow trouble knew exactly where I lived. And each time the nights grew longer, the man next door seemed closer than ever, as though fate itself was testing how much a heart could take before it broke. But let me ask you this: how much attention is too much? When someone listens to your silence more carefully than your partner listens to your words, is it wrong to feel drawn in? When your marriage feels like a room without windows and someone else shows you a glimpse of fresh air, what would you do? Tonight, I'm going to share with you a story that starts with a lonely wife, a hardworking husband, and a neighbor who never let the nights stay quiet. But the question is, was it comfort? Was it temptation? Or was it something I should have never let happen at all? Before I continue, I want you to think about this. If you were in my place, would you stay loyal to the silence? Or would you let yourself be carried away by the voice that refused to let you feel alone? Leave your thoughts in the comments below, and tell me, what would you have done? The nights in my house always felt longer than the days. When my husband left for work, I would stand by the window and watch the clock strike 10, then 11, then midnight. The sound of his car driving away left an emptiness behind, and in that silence, I felt like the walls knew my loneliness better than he did. I told myself I was strong, that I could handle it, that this was just marriage, sacrifices, and patience. But slowly, I began to notice the little things I was missing. A gentle word, a look that made me feel important, a presence that reminded me I wasn't invisible. The man next door, he wasn't a stranger. He had been living there for months, and yet, until recently, I never thought twice about him. He was polite, quiet, and carried himself with a calm confidence. He would smile when he saw me bringing in the mail, or nod when I watered the plants in the yard. It was normal, harmless. At least, that's what I kept telling myself. But as the nights stretched on and the loneliness grew heavier, I started noticing more about him. How he always seemed to appear when the street was silent, how his presence felt almost timed with my husband's absence. There was something unsettling about how easily he noticed the details my husband missed. If I had a new haircut, he mentioned it casually. If I looked tired, he asked if I was okay. It wasn't what he said, it was how he said it, as though he really meant it. And when someone truly sees you in your most ordinary state, it becomes harder to ignore. I tried to brush it off. I told myself it was just neighborly kindness. But my heart began to argue with my mind. Each night, when the house grew colder, I would catch myself wondering if he was awake too, just a few steps away. It scared me, how much space one thought could take up in my head. Meanwhile, my husband seemed more distant than ever. His work consumed him, and when he was home, his body was present, but his attention wasn't. He was too tired, too distracted, too far away, even when sitting right beside me. And that's when the danger began, not in grand gestures or forbidden words, but in the small, quiet spaces where longing has room to grow. It was never about a choice I made. It was about the silence that kept pulling me deeper into questions I wasn't ready to answer. Why did the man next door seem to know me better than the man I had married? Why did his presence echo louder in the night than my husband's voice ever did? And the question that kept me awake most of all, was I imagining it, or was he waiting for me too? The conflict grew in ways I never expected. On one side, there was my husband, a man I had loved for years, who had built our life with steady hands and endless sacrifices. I respected him for that. But on the other side, there was the quiet neighbor whose presence stirred emotions I thought I had buried long ago. The real battle wasn't about loyalty or temptation. It was about the hollow space that had formed inside me and how each of them filled it in such different ways. During the day, everything seemed normal. I played the role of a wife who managed the house, who smiled at neighbors, who waited for her husband to return. But at night, that normal facade started to crack. Every time I heard footsteps outside or the faint sound of a door closing, I wondered if it was him, the man next door. It wasn't just curiosity anymore. It felt like anticipation, and that scared me. The tension became worse when my husband noticed something was different about me. One evening, while he was lacing his boots for another night shift, he looked at me and asked why I seemed distracted. I brushed it off with a laugh, but my heart raced. He didn't know what was going on in my mind, but he sensed something. The irony was that he wasn't wrong. He just didn't realize that his absence had created the very gap I was now struggling to close. Meanwhile, small subplots of everyday life began weaving themselves into the bigger conflict. A neighborhood gathering where all three of us crossed paths left me shaken. The way my neighbor's eyes lingered on me just a moment too long, it was subtle, but I felt it. My husband didn't notice. Or maybe he chose not to. But I did. And the fact that I noticed made me question everything. Another angle that deepened the tension was the growing distance between me and my closest friends. They thought I was just tired from holding the household together. They didn't know I was hiding a storm inside. I couldn't tell them because how could I explain that my heart was restless not because of something that happened, but because of something that might happen? Every part of me wanted to believe I was strong enough to fight it, that I wouldn't let loneliness push me into dangerous places. Yet the nights kept testing me, and the presence next door was like a shadow I couldn't escape. And slowly, I began to wonder, was I the only one feeling this? Or was he silently waiting for me to cross that line? The tension finally reached a point where every small moment felt heavier than it should. Nights weren't just quiet anymore, they were charged, almost humming with something unspoken. I would sit on the couch pretending to watch television, but my eyes always drifted to the window. The glow of his porch light across the street became a signal, like a reminder that he was there, awake, only steps away. It was strange how someone could feel closer in the dark than the man who shared my bed during the day. One night, everything shifted. The power went out on our street, plunging the neighborhood into silence and shadow. I stood by the window, staring at the stillness outside, when I saw him. The outline of his figure, standing just beyond his doorway, almost as if he had been waiting. My heart pounded so loudly, I was afraid the sound would give me away. For a moment, we just looked toward each other across the street. No words, no movement, only an invisible pull that felt stronger than reason itself. When the lights came back, I quickly drew the curtains, but the image of him standing there burned in my mind. That night, I barely slept. My husband was working, unaware of the storm growing inside our home. I kept asking myself why I didn't just ignore it, why I couldn't just close my eyes to it all. But every unanswered question only drew me closer to the edge. The following weekend added more fuel to the fire. My husband decided to take an extra shift, leaving me alone for nearly 3 nights in a row. On the second night, I heard a soft knock at the door. My heart froze. It wasn't loud, just enough for me to know it wasn't an accident. I didn't open it. Instead, I stood frozen, my hand hovering over the doorknob, torn between fear and curiosity. Whoever it was left quietly, but I already knew. The silence outside was too familiar. From that moment, the air in the house felt different. Every creak of the floor, every flicker of light seemed to push me closer to something I wasn't ready to face. I could no longer deny it. This wasn't just in my head. The line I had been so afraid to cross was suddenly right in front of me, waiting. And as I stood there, torn between loyalty and temptation, I realized the next choice I made could change everything. Just when I thought I had a grip on my emotions, something happened that made everything more complicated. My husband came home early one morning, hours before I expected him. His face looked pale, his eyes heavy, and for a second, I thought he had discovered everything I was trying so hard to keep hidden inside me. But instead, he told me something that shook me in a different way. He might be asked to switch from night shifts to permanent day shifts. He said it casually, like it was just a work update, but to me, it was like the ground beneath my feet shifted. If he was home at night, everything would change. The distance I had grown so used to might vanish, but so would the space that had allowed this dangerous connection with the man next door to grow. At first, I thought this was a blessing. Maybe it was fate giving me a chance to step back, to rebuild what I had been losing with my husband. But deep down, I also felt a pang of panic. What would happen when the nights no longer belonged to me? Would the silence I had shared with my neighbor suddenly vanish, or would it find new ways to creep into my life? That same week, another twist deepened the tension. I received an unexpected message slipped under my door. It wasn't signed, but the handwriting was strong, deliberate, and the words were few. "I know you feel it too." My chest tightened as I read it. It wasn't just in my imagination anymore. What I had tried to brush off as coincidence or loneliness was now written down in front of me. The neighbor wasn't simply waiting. He was reaching out. I hid the note quickly, terrified my husband might see it. That piece of paper became heavier than anything I had ever held. Every time I looked at it, I felt both exposed and understood. Someone out there saw the cracks in my marriage, the ache in my silence, and dared to acknowledge it. But that also meant I was no longer safe in pretending this was just in my head. To make things even more complicated, my husband started asking questions about the neighbor. Small, casual ones at first. "Have you ever spoken to him? Or does he seem friendly?" Maybe it was harmless curiosity, or maybe he was beginning to notice something I thought I had hidden well. His words made my pulse race. Was he suspicious, or was this just bad timing? The days that followed were suffocating. I couldn't look at my husband without guilt, and I couldn't look at my neighbor without fear of what might happen next. Every evening, I felt trapped between two worlds, the safety of my marriage and the undeniable pull of something forbidden just beyond the walls of my home. And then came the night that changed everything. My husband kissed my forehead before leaving for his shift, promising he'd be back by dawn. I watched him drive away, my heart restless. Hours later, as the clock struck midnight, I heard it again, the soft, deliberate knock at my door. This time, I knew it wasn't just about curiosity. It was a choice, one that could no longer be ignored. The knock at the door echoed through the house like thunder, though it was soft enough that anyone else might have dismissed it. My hand trembled as I reached for the doorknob, torn between the loyalty I owed my husband and the pull of the neighbor who had already crossed into my thoughts too deeply. For a moment, I just stood there frozen. Then, almost without realizing, I opened the door. He was standing there, calm but with a look in his eyes that said everything his words had not. The silence between us was unbearable, as though the air itself was daring me to make a choice. My heart raced as I whispered, "You shouldn't be here." But he only replied softly, "Neither should you feel this alone." Those words cut deeper than I expected, and for the first time, I realized just how far I had drifted from the man I married. Before I could say anything more, headlights swept across the driveway. My stomach dropped. My husband's car. He wasn't supposed to be home for hours. Panic surged through me, and I turned to the neighbor, my voice shaking. "You have to leave." He didn't argue. He slipped into the shadows just as my husband walked through the door. My husband's eyes narrowed when he saw me standing by the open doorway, pale and shaken. "What's going on?" he asked, suspicion heavy in his tone. I stammered, struggling to come up with an answer that would hide the truth, but not sound like a lie. In that instant, I realized the line I had been dancing on was thinner than ever, ready to snap. But the twist came when my husband reached into his pocket and pulled out a small folded note, the same handwriting I had hidden days ago. "This was on the windshield of my car tonight," he said slowly, his eyes locked on mine. "I know you feel it too." The words were the same. My breath caught in my throat. The truth was out in the open, but not in the way I imagined. The neighbor hadn't only reached out to me, he had made sure my husband saw it too. Suddenly, this wasn't just my secret anymore. My husband's silence was more terrifying than anger. The story I had tried to keep buried was no longer mine alone. And in that moment, I understood. The nights would never be the same again. The silence that followed was heavier than any argument could have been. My husband held the note in his hand like it was proof of something he couldn't yet say out loud. I wanted to explain, to defend myself, to tell him that nothing had actually happened, but the truth was something had. Not in actions, but in thoughts, in emotions, in the quiet pull I hadn't been strong enough to shut out. And that, in its own way, was enough to break us. He didn't shout, didn't accuse me, didn't demand details. He simply looked at me with eyes that carried more pain than anger, as if the man who had worked endless nights for us had suddenly realized he had been building a life I wasn't even living in fully. That hurt more than if he had yelled. The weight of his disappointment was worse than any fight. The neighbor, as if sensing the storm, kept his distance after that night. His porch light still came on, but he never knocked again. The silence that once felt like temptation now felt like a reminder of what I had almost lost. And maybe that was the twist I needed, the realization that sometimes the danger isn't in the person outside your door, but in the emptiness you allow to grow inside your home. In the days that followed, my husband and I had conversations we hadn't dared to have in years. They were hard, raw, and sometimes painful. I admitted my loneliness, he admitted his exhaustion, and somewhere between those words, we began to understand how far we had drifted. Rebuilding wasn't going to be easy, but for the first time in a long time, we weren't pretending anymore. The note remained tucked away in a drawer, a reminder of the fragile line we had walked. I never told my husband everything, and maybe I didn't need to. What mattered was that we both saw the cracks clearly now, and we had a choice: either let them break us completely or work to seal them before it was too late. Life didn't go back to perfect. Marriage rarely does. But it did move forward, with more honesty, more effort, and more awareness of the silence that had once threatened to swallow us whole. And so, my story ends not with betrayal or escape, but with reflection. Sometimes the scariest temptations aren't about passion or desire, but about the dangerous comfort of being seen by someone else when you feel invisible at home. Now I want to ask you, if you were in my place, would you have opened the door that night, or would you have walked away before it ever got this far? Share your thoughts in the comments, and tell me if you'd like to hear what happened in the weeks after, because maybe this isn't the end, but only the beginning of another chapter.